Okay, ever feel like you're trying to, really focus on something? Like something important, maybe you're prepping for a big meeting or you're finally sitting down to work on that creative project you've been putting off.
Uh-huh.
But it's like your brain just feels like a web browser with like 50 tabs open, you know? Every notification, every stray thought is just pulling you away.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like I don't know if you remember that scene from the book Hyperfocus,
Yes.
where the author, he describes a diner, right? It's full of people, like they're physically there together, but every single person is just lost in their phone.
Right.
And their attention is just a million miles away. And I think that's really the challenge that we're kind of diving into today, this idea of understanding this incredible resource that we have, which is our attention.
Yeah.
And how to actually manage it so we can get more done, so we can be more creative, and so we can feel a little less, I don't know, frazzled by the constant distractions of modern life.
Exactly. And, this book, Hyperfocus, it came to our attention because of you, our listener. And that really tells us that you are wrestling with these issues, that you are looking for a better way to manage your attention. So our goal here is to really unpack Chris Bailey's work in a way that goes beyond just summarizing what the book says. We want to pull out those really useful insights and understand the science behind why we focus or why we don't focus, and pinpoint what's really hijacking our attention and equip you with really practical strategies to sharpen that focus and boost your productivity and your creative thinking. And importantly, we'll also explore this idea, this fascinating idea that sometimes the most productive thing we can do is to intentionally unfocus.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Let's talk about, why does focus even matter so much? The book kind of paints a pretty stark picture, I think, of our current environment.
It does.
There's this research, apparently, in cognitive psychology that shows that people who are working in front of a computer, they average only about 40 seconds of focused work before they're interrupted, or get this, before they interrupt themselves. 40 seconds.
That's incredible.
I know, and when you think about that, it really highlights just how fragmented our attention has become. And I know for me, I've certainly felt that sensation of being constantly busy and bouncing from task to task, but reaching the end of the day and thinking, what did I actually accomplish? And the author himself, he's a self-proclaimed productivity enthusiast. He talks about this, how he experienced this firsthand, that he felt incredibly busy. But when he sort of sat down to really analyze it, he was achieving surprisingly little.
And what's so fascinating about that is the book points out something that I think is quite counterintuitive about what helps us focus.
Okay.
It's not necessarily the complexity of a task itself, but our
Yeah.
genuine interest in it that allows us to really concentrate.
Yeah.
And you think about it, if you're trying to wade through like a really dense research paper
Right.
on a topic that you just find boring,
Yeah.
feels like such a monumental effort.
It's a slog.
Whereas if it's something that really sparks your curiosity, it's like the words just flow.
You get lost in it. Yeah.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
I think right from the start, we see that managing our attention isn't just about sheer willpower.
Right.
It's also really deeply connected to how we engage with what we choose to focus on.
Right. So we know focus is crucial because distractions are everywhere and we often feel busy without being truly productive. So let's get into the mechanics of attention here. The book introduces this idea of attentional space. Can you kind of break down for us, what is attentional space?
Sure. Think of attentional space like the limited mental capacity that your brain has to hold and actively process information at any given moment. So it's like, I think the author uses a really good analogy. It's like the RAM in your computer,
Okay.
or what we often refer to as working memory. And so the key takeaway here is that this space is surprisingly small. We can only hold a few distinct pieces of information in our attentional space at once. I think it's roughly 4, according to some of the research mentioned in the book. And it's this limited space that allows us to kind of temporarily hold information, manipulate it, make connections between different ideas on the fly.
So it's like a very small mental workspace.
Yeah, exactly.
How do different kinds of tasks then fit into this limited space?
That's a crucial point to understand. And the book explains that different tasks consume varying amounts of our attentional space, depending on how complex or engaging they are. For example, a really meaningful and absorbing conversation
Right.
can take up almost all of your attentional space.
Yeah, you've been there.
You've probably experienced this, like trying to have a deep conversation with someone while also like scrolling through social media.
You can't do both.
It just doesn't work well. You can't fully engage in both.
Yeah.
On the other hand, like habitual tasks, things we do almost automatically, like walking and chewing gum, as the saying goes, Those require very little attentional space.
Okay.
So that's why we can seemingly multitask with habits. However, when it comes to complex tasks, the ones that really require our focused attention, they demand most, if not all, of our available attentional space.
Wow.
So it's not just about wanting to multitask on these complex projects.
Mm.
Our brain literally doesn't have enough RAM to do it effectively.
That's so interesting.
It is. It is. And I think that's a really powerful reason to embrace single tasking.
It is, yeah. So what happens then when we try to cram too much into this very limited mental workspace?
Well, that's when we run into something that Chris Bailey calls attention overload.
Okay.
And the consequences can be, they can be pretty significant.
I can imagine.
When we try to juggle too many things in our mental workspace, it leads to forgetfulness. The book gives some really relatable examples like, you tend to buy bread on the way home.
Right.
And then you completely forget.
Yes, all the time.
Or that moment at the grocery store checkout where you forget to put down the divider. We start to feel overwhelmed, our productivity really takes a nosedive, and our memory suffers. The book also touches on how constantly seeking out new and novel stimuli, like endlessly scrolling through social media feeds.
Right.
This can give us this feeling of being productive because we're processing a lot of information in each moment, but it doesn't necessarily translate to actual accomplishment of meaningful tasks.
It's like that illusion of productivity.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
Our brains are naturally drawn to novelty. But that constant shifting of focus can be really detrimental to deeper, more meaningful work.
Okay, so attentional space is limited, and overloading it has really negative consequences. Now, let's talk about the title of this book, Hyperfocus. What exactly is hyperfocus? How does it relate to this concept of attentional space that we've been discussing?
Okay, think back to a day when you felt incredibly productive. That kind of uber productive day that the book describes. Chances are, you are probably really deeply focused on just one single task. Maybe you had a looming deadline, and that one task probably occupied your entire attentional space.
Yeah.
You were probably also really good at deflecting distractions and kind of getting back on track quickly when interruptions did occur.
Uh-huh.
And even though your mind might have wandered briefly, it did so less frequently than usual, you were able to bring it back to the task at hand. The work itself probably felt challenging enough to be engaging.
Right.
But not so difficult that it was overwhelming, maybe even leading to that state of flow where you lose track of time.
Yeah, you get in the zone. Yeah.
Exactly. And importantly, even though you were working intensely, you didn't feel completely drained afterward.
Right.
In fact, you might have even felt energized.
Right, yeah. I definitely recognize those kinds of days. So how does it actually fit into this picture of attentional space then?
Okay, well, hyperfocus, as the book defines it, is essentially the act of keeping one important and complex object of attention in your attentional space.
Okay.
And so when you do this, a few key things happen.
Why?
First, because you're dedicating most of your mental capacity to a single task, you actually have a little bit of attentional space left over, enough to keep your original intention in mind.
Okay.
Okay, so this makes you much less susceptible to distractions because you have that awareness to notice when you're about to be derailed. And then perhaps most crucially, you have enough attentional resources left over to think really deeply and strategically about the task as you're working on it.
Interesting.
And the book also points to research showing that it takes us significantly longer to return to a task after we've been distracted, especially if we're the ones who initiated the distraction. So maintaining that hyper-focused state really minimizes those costly interruptions.
That makes sense, yeah. So the book also emphasizes this idea that hyperfocus is most effective when it's applied to certain types of tasks, right? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so hyper-focus is particularly powerful when it's applied to what the book calls necessary and purposeful tasks.
Okay.
These are the tasks that might not always be the most immediately appealing,
Right.
but they are highly productive, and they contribute significantly to our long-term goals, whether they're professional or personal goals.
Gotcha.
Think about writing an important report, developing a long-term strategic plan, or having a really meaningful conversation with a loved one. These contrast with what the book calls unnecessary and distracting tasks,
Right.
such as like attending pointless meetings or endlessly scrolling through social media. And so, while we can sometimes get by on autopilot, just kind of reacting to whatever comes our way, hyperfocus allows us to actively choose where we're directing our limited time and attention. and
Yes.
focusing on the tasks that truly move the needle. And the book even suggests creating a really simple 2 by 2 grid. Categorize your tasks based on whether they are attractive or unattractive, and whether they are productive or unproductive.
Gotcha.
And this can be a really helpful visual tool to kind of identify where should you be directing your hyperfocus efforts.
Interesting. So, kind of mapping it out. Now, the book also places a strong emphasis on the role of intentions in guiding our focus. So, can we talk a little bit about what's the difference between just having this kind of vague idea of what we want to do
Right.
and setting a really clear intention?
I think that's a really critical distinction.
Mhm.
We often have these general intentions like, I should really go to the gym more, or I need to work on that big project. But while those are a good starting point, the book highlights the research of Peter Gollwitzer on the power of setting what he calls really specific implementation intentions.
Okay.
Okay, so these aren't just about what you want to achieve, but when, where, and how you will do it.
Right.
So instead of just thinking, go to the gym, an implementation intention would be something like, I will go to the gym on Tuesday and Thursday during my lunch break for 45 minutes,
Yeah.
and I will do a cardio workout starting with 15 minutes on the treadmill.
Right.
So Gollwitzer's research found that people who set these very specific implementation intentions were significantly more likely to actually achieve their goals.
It makes it real.
It does. It does. And it was like a really, really impressive 62% success rate compared to just 22% for those who just had those vague intentions. And this is because these specific plans essentially put our brains on autopilot for goal achievement. When the specific cue arises, like your lunch break on Tuesday, you automatically initiate the planned action with less conscious effort.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that 62% success rate is huge. Think about that one goal that you've been putting off. Right now, it's probably a bit vague. How could you make it super specific? The when, the where, and the how of it.
It's such a big difference. So how do we actually get into this state of hyperfocus? What are the practical steps? The book outlines kind of 4 key stages, right?
It does. There are 4 key stages to kind of intentionally enter hyperfocus. The first is to select one specific and important intention to focus on, and this brings a lot of clarity to what you're aiming to accomplish. The second stage is to eliminate as many distractions as possible from your environment, and this just creates a much clearer mental pathway for your attention. The third stage is to focus your attention intently on the chosen task. Really bring all your mental resources to bear. And then the final stage, which is absolutely crucial, is to notice when you inevitably become distracted.
Right.
And then gently redirect your attention back to your original intention. Mind wandering is just a natural part of how our brains work, even when we're trying to hyper-focus. So this act of kind of consciously redirecting is key.
So we set an intention, clear the decks, focus intently, and then redirect when our minds wander. That sounds straightforward enough in theory.
It does.
But in practice, distractions are everywhere, as we all know.
They are.
So the book dedicates a whole chapter to taming these distractions. So what are some of the core insights from that section?
One of the most important points I think the book makes is that we are often our own worst enemies
Oh, yeah.
when it comes to distractions.
Yeah.
Research indicates that we interrupt ourselves just as often, if not more frequently, than external factors pull us away.
We're the problem.
Yeah, we are. We are. And so the book helpfully categorizes distractions into 4 types based on 2 axes.
Okay.
One is whether they are annoying or enjoyable. And the second is whether we have control over them or not.
Gotcha.
And so it's a really valuable exercise, I think, for you, the listener, to think about like creating your own personal grid of distractions to really gain a better understanding of, what most commonly hijacks your attention.
Right.
And so, examples could range from like uncontrollable, annoying distractions like, unexpected visits from colleagues in an open office.
Yeah.
Or, controllable, enjoyable distractions like the lure of social media.
Ah, yeah.
So it's kind of, figuring out where you fall on that grid.
Right. So once we've identified these common distractions, what strategies does the book offer for actually dealing with them?
Well, for those distractions that we can't directly control, like that loud conversation happening nearby, the key is to consciously keep your original intention clearly in mind and to make a deliberate effort to return your focus to the task at hand as quickly as possible after the interruption. But for the distractions that we can control, things like checking email or social media, the book really advocates for creating what he calls a dedicated distraction-free mode.
Okay.
And this involves setting really clear boundaries and schedules for engaging with things like email, social media, and even attending meetings.
Okay.
So some really specific tactics include, turning off all non-essential notifications on your devices. Those little pings and buzzes.
Yeah.
They're incredibly effective at pulling us away.
They really are, yeah.
They really are. And strategically using airplane mode
Okay.
during periods of focused work is also highly recommended.
I like that.
The author even shares a personal tip about creating what he calls a mindless folder on your phone
Oh.
for all those like autopilot apps.
Right.
By putting them in a folder and adding this extra step,
Right.
it introduces a layer of friction that can make you think twice before just mindlessly opening them.
Yeah.
And of course, regularly pruning unnecessary apps from your phone altogether can also make a big difference.
Okay. Email, it seems to be something that comes up a lot in a lot of these conversations around focus.
It does.
As a major source of distraction. So
Yeah.
what specific advice does the book provide for managing our inboxes more effectively?
Well, email definitely gets a lot of attention in the book, and for good reason.
Mm-hmm.
The author suggests drastically limiting email notifications to reduce those constant interruptions that break our concentration. And he recommends only checking for new messages, really at specific times when you have the time, the attention, and the energy to properly deal with whatever might have come in, rather than just reacting impulsively every time you hear that ding.
Right.
The author even suggests keeping a tally of how often you check your email throughout the day. And turns out the average knowledge worker checks it dozens of times an hour,
Wow.
which is far more frequently than they actually spend processing emails.
Oh, that's interesting.
It is. And pre-deciding on specific blocks of time throughout the day to check your email can be incredibly effective in reducing that constant urge to peek. And if you find that email is just too tempting even when it's closed, the book suggests exploring the use of distraction blocking software that can temporarily prevent you from accessing it.
Okay.
He also briefly touches on the idea of hyper-focusing on email itself.
Okay, so dedicating.
Yeah, setting a timer for, say, 20 minutes and just blasting through as many messages as possible during that dedicated block of time.
Gotcha. In addition to email, meetings also come up a lot as a potential culprit in the productivity drain.
He do.
What's the book's perspective on how we can make meetings less of a distraction?
Well, pointless or poorly run meetings are highlighted as a significant drain on our time and attention. And the book offers a few key strategies. First, never attend a meeting unless there's a clear and specific agenda.
Okay.
And if there isn't one, don't hesitate to question the meeting's purpose and suggest alternative ways to achieve the objective. Maybe a quick email exchange or a brief phone call. Second, critically evaluate every recurring meeting on your calendar.
Okay.
Are they truly still necessary and valuable?
Good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. And finally, always challenge the list of attendees. Does everyone who's invited actually need to be there and actively contribute? Often, the answer is no, and you can free up valuable time for both yourself and your colleagues.
Well, we can't really have a conversation about distractions these days without talking about the internet.
Right.
And it's a seemingly endless source of potential distractions.
Yeah.
So does the book offer any advice, specific advice for managing our online time and staying focused when we need to be online?
It does. The internet really does underlie so many of these distractions.
Right.
And while creating a distraction-free mode certainly helps, the book really emphasizes the importance of being very intentional about how we use the internet. Just like our minds wander during work, we often find ourselves kind of surfing the internet aimlessly,
Going down the rabbit hole.
Exactly. Clicking from one interesting link to another. And so the key is to bring a greater sense of purpose to our online activities and to actively minimize that kind of autopilot browsing that can so easily derail our focus.
In addition to all these distractions that kind of come at us through our screens, there's our physical environment.
Right.
And it also plays a role in our ability to concentrate.
It does.
Does it?
Yes. Our external surroundings have a surprisingly powerful impact on our focus.
It's true.
The book discusses the power of what are called environmental cues.
Okay.
So removing novel and visually appealing distractions from your immediate workspace can make it significantly easier to sustain your concentration for longer periods of time.
That makes sense.
Even the cleanliness and organization of your office space can play a role.
Really?
Yeah. Research suggests that neater environments tend to be more conducive to focused work,
Interesting.
whereas messier spaces, though sometimes linked to creativity, can be more distracting when you're trying to hyperfocus. The author even shares a personal anecdote about struggling with snack cravings and how simply removing unhealthy snacks from his immediate environment made a big difference in his ability to focus on his work instead of thinking about food.
Oh, interesting.
So, the key is to become much more deliberate about the cues that you allow into your environment, right? And to really question, how might they be subtly affecting your ability to stay on task? Even something as simple as placing the documents you need for your next task in a visible spot can act as a helpful cue to direct your attention.
Okay. Now, what about music? Is that generally a help or a hindrance when we're trying to focus?
Music is a bit of a nuanced topic
Okay.
when it comes to focus. The book suggests that instrumental music, particularly music without a strong or complex structure or lyrics,
Okay.
is generally less distracting for most people. Think of like more ambient or repetitive sounds
Okay.
that tend to kind of fade into the background. However, in noisy environments like a bustling coffee shop or something,
Yeah.
listening to music, especially through noise-canceling headphones, can actually be beneficial by kind of effectively blocking out, the more unpredictable and distracting sounds, like snippets of conversations or things like that.
Hmm.
And interestingly, the book mentions that overhearing just one side of a phone conversation
Right.
can be particularly distracting because our brains try to fill in the missing pieces of the dialogue.
Oh, that's so interesting.
It is. It is. But, ultimately, I think the effect of music on focus can vary depending on the type of work you're doing, the specific environment you're in,
Hmm.
and even your own individual preferences.
So it's very personal. Okay, we've talked a lot about these external distractions. But what about the internal chatter in our own minds? The book mentions this importance of clearing your mind. How do we effectively deal with those internal distractions?
Internal distractions, those random thoughts, worries, and ideas that pop into our head
Uh-huh.
and pull us away from the task at hand, are just as significant as external distractions.
It's true.
And so the book really emphasizes the importance of clearing your mind and these open loops.
Hmm.
And it refers to David Allen's work in Getting Things Done
Okay.
and his principle of externalizing your commitments and tasks.
Right.
So, maintaining a comprehensive to-do list and using a calendar to schedule tasks effectively
Mm-hmm.
turns these internal reminders into external cues,
Right.
which can free up a lot of space in our attentional space.
Yeah.
Similarly, keeping what's called like a distractions list, where you just quickly jot down any distracting thoughts as they arise, allows you to kind of acknowledge them and commit to dealing with them later
Mm-hmm.
without letting them derail your current focus.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you're a worrier,
Right.
writing down, what's weighing on your mind can sometimes help contain those thoughts.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
prevent them from constantly intruding. The fundamental idea is to get these internal distractions out of your head so they're not constantly vying for your limited attention.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here on strategies for taming both these external and internal distractions.
Yeah.
Now, how do we actually make this practice of hyperfocus a consistent habit in our daily lives?
Well, the book kind of revisits these three key measures of attention quality that we touched on earlier.
Yeah.
The amount of time we actually spend working with focused intention,
Yeah.
the length of our uninterrupted focus sessions, and how quickly we notice when our mind has started to wander. And the various tactics we've discussed for taming distractions
Right.
really naturally support improvements in all three of these areas.
Mm-hmm.
So, by actively creating distraction-free environments and distraction-free modes, we're dedicating specific blocks of time to intentional work
Right.
and minimizing those attractive stimuli that would typically pull our attention away. And working in an environment with fewer distractions in general naturally allows us to sustain our focus for longer periods. And by kind of consciously training ourselves to be more aware of when we do become distracted, we get better at noticing those mind wanderings earlier and redirecting our attention back to the task at hand.
Yeah.
And furthermore, the act of hyperfocus itself, by its very nature, focusing intently on a single complex task, tends to occupy more of our attentional space, which inherently reduces the likelihood and frequency of mind wandering.
That's interesting. So the book also touches on this importance of aligning the difficulty of our tasks with our current skill level in order to maintain that optimal focus, right?
Yes, absolutely. So if the demands of a task significantly exceed our current skill level, we tend to feel overwhelmed and anxious, which makes sustained focus really difficult. Conversely, if our skills far surpass the demands of a task, we often become bored and our attention starts to bleed out.
Sure.
The ideal sweet spot for really deep engagement and sustained focus is when the challenge of the task is roughly in balance with our ability to tackle it.
Okay.
And that's when we're most likely to become really absorbed in our work and experience that sense of flow. So if you find yourself consistently struggling to hyperfocus, it's worth taking a moment to consider, are the tasks you're trying to concentrate on a good match for your current level of skill and experience?
So kind of that Goldilocks, right? Not too hard, not too easy, but just right.
Exactly, exactly.
Okay. And there's also a mention in the book of Parkinson's law in this context. The idea that work tends to expand to fill the time available for its completion. How does that relate to hyperfocus and managing distractions?
Well, Parkinson's law essentially suggests that if you give yourself a week to complete a task that realistically only requires a couple of hours of focused work,
Okay.
it will likely end up taking you the entire week.
Right.
So by proactively eliminating distractions and consciously practicing hyperfocus, you might find, as the author himself did, that your work no longer automatically expands to fill all the available time.
Right.
And you might gain a much clearer picture of the true volume of work, of essential work that you actually have on your plate. The book even suggests that the feeling of guilt or unease when we're not actively busy might actually be a sign that we don't have enough, truly important high-impact work to be focusing on. And this is often why those less critical, busy work tasks tend to get pushed aside when we're approaching deadlines for those more important projects, because there simply isn't enough time left for them.
That's interesting. So, in our quest to improve our focus and our attention spans, many of us are tempted by those quick fixes, like those brain training apps
Right.
that are so widely advertised. So what is the book's perspective on the effectiveness of these types of tools?
The book takes a fairly skeptical view of most brain training apps that claim to significantly improve attention and memory. While some of these apps might demonstrate, short-term gains, the very specific tasks that they're designed to train, the book points to a lack of robust scientific evidence that those benefits actually transfer to real-world improvements in overall attention, working memory capacity, or cognitive function. Often you need to dedicate a significant amount of time each week to these apps to maintain any perceived effect.
Right.
And those gains tend to disappear fairly quickly once you stop using the app. Yeah. And one large-scale study that was cited in the book actually found no evidence that brain training apps actually improved the cognitive abilities they were specifically designed to target,
Yeah.
even within the context of the games themselves.
Wow. So if these brain training apps aren't the answer, what does the book suggest as more effective ways to actually boost our attentional capabilities? It mentions meditation and mindfulness practices as valuable tools, right?
Absolutely. Meditation and mindfulness practices have been consistently shown to increase working memory capacity and significantly improve the overall quality of our attention. So similar to the practice of hyperfocus, meditation involves repeatedly bringing your attention back to a single chosen object of focus, most commonly your breath, whenever you notice your mind wandering. And so this repeated act of kind of consciously redirecting your attention is like exercise for our executive functions.
Yeah, okay.
Those brain processes that govern our ability to control our focus and manage our cognitive tasks. And so, over time, this regular practice can lead to noticeably longer attention spans, reduction in mind wandering, and a greater overall ability to work with intention and clarity. And even dedicating just a few minutes each day to mindfulness or meditation can have a really positive impact on your attentional control. The book even suggests incorporating mindfulness into everyday activities, like mindful showering, where you just intentionally focus all of your senses on the sensations of the present moment. I think both meditation and mindfulness not only seem to help expand the capacity of our attentional space, but also make us more skilled at maintaining our intentions and quickly recognizing when our attention has strayed.
So we've spent a lot of time discussing hyperfocus, this intentional directed attention. However, the book also explores the power of scatterfocus.
It does.
What exactly is scatterfocus and how is it different from hyperfocus?
Okay, well, scatterfocus is, in essence, the opposite of hyperfocus. Instead of deliberately and narrowly directing your attention to one specific thing, you intentionally allow your mind to wander relatively freely, directing your attention inward. And so the book kind of proposes this idea that hyperfocus is our brain's productive mode, whereas scatterfocus acts as its creative mode.
Okay.
And you naturally enter this state whenever you allow your attentional space to be more open and less directed. while you're engaged in an activity that doesn't demand your full concentration, such as, going for a leisurely walk, engaging in a simple hobby, or even just relaxing without a specific goal in mind.
So what are the primary benefits of kind of intentionally allowing our minds to wander in this way?
Well, scatterfocus allows for three really powerful things, I think.
Right.
First, it provides a mental space for setting intentions and planning for the future. So, when you're really deeply immersed in the present moment during hyperfocus,
Right.
it can be really difficult to step back and think about, broader goals
Right.
or upcoming tasks. So scatterfocus